is really a pleasure for me for all sorts of ways. Chuck Larson brought me on board. He's over there. He said he wanted to be next to his best friend, and sometimes referred to as the anchor, McCain, and he's there. And in the last years of Stockdale's life, I did interview him, and interestingly, he said, you know, Stoicism was the silver lining. His wife, Sybil Stockdale, said, not for me. But as a POW, 7.5 years, 2.5 in leg irons, he had remembered from Stanford that book, Epictetus, and he has a kind of Cagney accent, and he can kind of roll off most of Epictetus's handbook by heart. And he said to me, you know, I try to convert people, you know, with the tapping on the walls, but I got dead silence. And then he said, I realized the other POWs had their ducks lined up in their own way. And I suspect McCain was one of those persons he tried not to convert. He knew better. So I also just want to say, filling Senator McCain's term right now is, some of you know Martha McSally. And politics aside, she did come before the Senate and talk about a very important moral injury, and that is military rape within the military institution. She was silent because she felt she had been betrayed by the institution previously and couldn't come forward. And just a historical note, PTSD, Sherman can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the founding of the diagnosis was in part by seeing Vietnam veterans and a confluence of symptoms that survivors of rape in Boston, says Judith Herman in wonderful book, Fear and Trauma, were showing as well. So they go together, and it's important. In some of my work, I've talked specifically about the uphill battle for women. Rape is not just against women by any means, but keep that in mind as a kind of moral injury, even if we don't speak about it directly. So I want to begin with, let's see how, so there's a clicker somewhere here, let's see. I want to begin with C.J. Chivers, a Marine, and New York Times war correspondent, and a book that he came out with called The Fighters, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning article in the New York Times Magazine called The Fighter. And this is a case that Chris Chivers begins with, or has in the book. Layne McDowell was meant for a cockpit. He had wanted to fly since junior high. The Air Force turned him down because of a bad knee, but the Academy took him, graduated 3.84 GPA, and soon discovered he also not only wanted to fly, but he had the physiology to fly. He was a G monster, able to withstand 9G over time in the spin and puke centrifuge. He could physically endure and make peace with willful self-defensive killing of combatants. And what he took were just wars. But one event unhinged him, and it was May 1999, so Kosovo. Intelligence imagery was grainy. In order not to alert Serbian forces, he had to go south of the target and make a quick turn back. Air crews had less time to locate and verify the target. And then the Serbian air defense opened up fire. And McDowell's attention was taken away a bit from the targeting screen. I felt good about the release, he tells Chivers. Then clouds obscured the target until about 13 seconds to impact. At that time, I began having doubts about the target. I don't think I'm going to use this quite yet. I didn't say anything, but we took out what we were targeting with 2 GBU guided bomb munitions units, GBU 12s. Then dread started to mount. Back on the carrier, McDowell looked at the strike footage, and the bomb had struck not the target, but a car porch. And what he saw were 4 bikes, 2 of which were child-sized. So there were never any legal proceedings. Chris spent a lot of time in the Pentagon trying to follow this up, and he's an investigative reporter. I think he's one of the best war correspondents there is. But McDowell did his own after-incident investigation, and it was in a dream. And the dream replayed night after night, and it replayed especially before he deployed to Iraq in 2005, 6 years later. The building he bombed was somehow still standing, but there was thick dust everywhere. Insulation and wires were dangling down, and he definitely saw a child. And he went to the child was covered in dust, and he cradled the child, and he held his head, and there was no back of the head. It was a skull without a back of the head, and it was his own child, Landon. So this case I've just retold of Layne McDowell, Navy aviator, is accidental killing. It wasn't collateral killing. And unlike some collateral killings that may be justified as necessarily militarily or more often excused, accidents like these that abound in war are never justified as necessary or eliminative killings. The act is transgressive of someone who is not liable to killing. And even if the individual's acts are legally or morally excusable, maybe in the above case, poor intelligence, diffuse lines of responsibility, fog of war facts, still innocents have been killed. And it is the proximate cause of the incident, namely this aviator who carries the moral burden. And his punishment comes in this dream, this intrusive, recurrent, perseverating nightmare. And it also comes in his growing lukewarm about flying missions, a very excited aviator who then grows lukewarm on it. And he yearns to know who he can make compensation to, and instead he works, I presume, on atonement, but also he tells his story to Chivers himself, who was with him a lot of the time in battle. And that's a kind of way of understanding what happened. So this is not an uncommon story. I think it's a salient case of military moral injury. What's puzzling in this case is that the transgression that causes so much moral distress may not run afoul of strict morality or legality of war. The agent can exculpate himself, though the doctrine of war can. We could say, as I've often said in my work, that this is just the grandiosity of moral agency, especially of war fighters like those of you here who are raised on perfection and zero tolerance of screwing up, whether it's a rifle you can't keep clean or expensive munitions that you fail to use properly. Many hold themselves, to use the legal term, strictly liable, even when they ought not. But I think shunting all or most military moral injury to psychological overreach or the overtraining of you in a very moral environment, as this place is, misses the greater moral landscape. Even if moral sensitivities don't always accurately track what's permissible and impermissible, and how could they? They are sort of blunt tools often. And many don't feel them at all. They're wanton. They feel no pangs of guilt. They often do point to morally relevant phenomena eclipsed by modern moral criteria focused narrowly on assessing action. And that was Nancy Snow's point about showing us Elizabeth Anscombe and Iris Murdoch and their revival of virtue ethics in Britain. That point is fundamentally Aristotelian. Virtue is a matter of apt actions and emotions, as Mitt was telling us yesterday. Moral injury and its related emotions, experienced and often expressed in speech and comportment. What we didn't hear from Dr. Thompson is that I spent some time a few years ago at the Institute for Ballet and the Arts, Contemporary Ballet and the Arts, thinking about military comportment and drill and dance. There's a long history of the two going together. There's a lot of, and this relates to John Doris's point, there's a lot about what you show in your body that does express virtue or conceals it. Maybe it masks it, etc. So moral injury and its related emotions are deeply connected to virtue and to aspirations to it. Granted, some moral injury corrodes character. I do think you can lose character. I do think that character can get corrupted. Good character can get corrupted under horrible circumstances. For others, moral injury, if it doesn't undo character, it can come from character that already is corrupted. But for those experiencing moral injury, and some for whom it's corrupted, moral injury may be the beginning of redemption. You have a moment where you just can't do this anymore. But other cases of moral injury may be less severe and constitutive of overall healthy good character. If a service member didn't feel these emotions, we'd wonder about her humanity. So this brings me to my topic today. Let's see if I can use this. This is my worry. There's a tension in military culture between a growing recognition of moral injury, witness this conference, as often, but not always, a healthy expression of, an adaptive expression of moral conscience, and this strong attraction to Stoic virtue. Stockdale in front of Luce Hall, and very much a mantra of Stoicism. And Stoic ideals of virtue sometimes are seen as weaning oneself from the disquiet of emotions, the resentment, the guilt, the shame that comes with moral injury. And so my question is, put bluntly, is moral injury compatible with a Stoic view, a Stoic emotion-lean view of grit and resilience? Does that emotion-lean view of virtue do justice to Stoic doctrine? And when we read Stoicism or Stoic texts, are we reaping the right lessons from them? And so, you'll see Seneca as one of the unsung heroes here. So, and my worry is not just academic or textual. I do study ancient texts, but the worry really has to do with education and and programs like this one here, NE 203 MIDS. You can kill me for that one. You had to live through it. If Roman Stoics such as Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and redactors like Cicero are sources of inspiration for training military resilience, are we reaping the right lessons when we read those texts? What do we miss that could be helpful? And I should say the attraction to Stoicism is not just military. The tech world has bought on 100% Silicon Valley. If they're not yet wearing togas, they will soon be wearing togas. They go on retreats. There are places called Cicero Institute for lobbying, and I'm not sure if they lobby about calm, but they all need calm out there, apparently. If you're looking for angel money, you also need to look for some meditative quiet if you don't find it. So the plan is this. I'm not a PowerPoint lover, but we'll use a little bit. Let's think about moral injury philosophically in terms of P.F. Strawson in an influential 1962 article where he talked about reactive attitudes. This is how I think about it in Afterword. Is there room in Stoic emotions for moral distress or moral injury? And I think of it as spectral. And I suggest that Seneca, a remarkable writer, was not a remarkably good exemplar, a pure exemplar. So here's where we go with not all people you read embody their lessons. Don't take it all so seriously. Is there room for aspirational emotions, which I sort of think of as moral distress emotions sometimes, shame, guilt. And a great example is, if you remember Alcibiades, who breaks into the symposium, we'll talk about that in a minute, and Cicero in Tusculan Disputations, written upon the death of his daughter in childbirth. And then I want to turn to Seneca the tragedian. It's disputed in the literature if he really wrote the tragedies. I think he did, but I haven't done the translations myself, so I wouldn't even begin to weigh in on this. But I think the evidence is that he did write them, even though they show a very different side of Seneca than some of the writings we know. Okay, so the leading research, and this comes from Shearer's work, Shearer McGuinn's work with Brett Litz and Bill Nash in the VA and Marine Corps, et cetera, and Navy, is that moral injury is a syndrome of shame, self-handicapping, anger, and demoralization that occurs when deeply held beliefs and expectations about moral and ethical conduct are transgressed. That's 2016. The critical piece of moral injury research, I think, for my purposes, is that it's distinct from PTS because it's not based on fear. It's not about fear. It's not about security threats. It's about moral conflict threats. And so it's not based, 1980 was a breakthrough because we were all into behaviorism, and PTSD was something out, there was fear out there, and it was a natural response to fear is hypervigilance, dissociation, and intrusive dreams, intrusive thoughts, etc., where the cause is outside. Life threat that you can't control. But that's not the only kind of moral anxiety, moral trauma, moral anguish, or psychological anguish, psychological trauma. There's moral stuff as well, and that's mostly what I hear about. Now, the deck is stacked. I'm a moral philosopher, so people aren't going to tell me a lot about their fear stuff. They're going to tell me more about their moral conflicts. But and I'm not doing any empirical-based evidence collection, anecdotal, from returning veterans in my classes and the like. But that's what I hear the most, and I think it's important. That's not to say that the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual 5, hasn't noted this. They have included, in addition to fear, anger, and guilt and shame, but more psychiatrists like to talk about disorder, mood disorder, and I'm not really talking about moods. So I'm not a clinician, disclosure. I have had psychoanalytic training, and I've long argued that it is wrong to think of all moral injury as pathological or maladaptive. That's in no way to minimize behavioral mental health therapy. If I had my way, we would just finally destigmatize it worldwide and nationwide, and I don't know how to legislate that except through lots of money and brainwashing to get people to get help. And that's all of us, including leaders. Get people to have help. Show that you yourself have done it, and it isn't a career killer. I think it's really, really important, and I say that young mids going forward. Lead by showing and destigmatize mental health. It's so critical. I sat on the Suicide Review Board at the Pentagon with Peter Corelli. I went to some of those meetings, and it was heartbreaking, and he was, I think, the angriest general I have ever seen. What are the lessons forward? What can we learn? Closed room, no windows, screens like this all around, coming in from Korea, coming in from Fort Bragg and other places about suicide incident briefs of that past month. It was horrific, and we need to do more. So my point is, we're not going to use a mono lens thinking about moral injury. I think about it as an accountability practice, a responsibility practice, following Strawson, and and some of the moral disquiet can be very adaptive going forward in checking the kinds of incidents Reagan was talking about yesterday with respect to Haditha. How the unconscious and subconscious works neuronally, I can't speak to that, but I do think wiring gets laid down in various ways. So here, think of a fighter feeling pangs of guilt in the wake of a permissive collateral killing of a high-value target, say Zerkawi, where his family was probably there. Tony and I talked a little bit about this case. Or think about shame in a high-stake political dealing with a warlord, as corrupt as all sin, but you got to deal with them. Or being the bearer of paltry consolation money to a family that lost 3 members in the crosshairs of fire in the Mansour district in Baghdad. He was the bearer of a paltry $750, which left him morally injured. It was an institutional betrayal, among many. He came to engage and destroy, and he spent 5 years trying to rebuild a fallen city. And that's, I'm going to show you some masks. These are masks, care of Melissa Walker at Bethesda Naval, Walter Reed. She works with soldiers often at the National Intrepid Center for Excellence, NICO Center, on the campus at Bethesda Naval. And she is an art therapist. They're never solely done on their own, part of larger psychotherapy process. And this is one that Jeff Hall shared with me. And this is another one. He's a wonderful drawer, a horse mired in mud. That is how he felt. some of you may know his story, but anyway, he essentially spent months trying to get bodies back for proper burial, and finally when he got them back, the Iraqi Ministry of Health had labeled on it enemy combatants. And it was a Christian family needing a burial, bodies had rotted. He felt every step of the way he could not make any progress institutionally. He felt betrayed. This is National Geographic. They did a series on these masks, and then we brought them to the VA main headquarters in Washington on a display case for a while, in a rare cooperation between the Pentagon and the VA. And that's Jeff with his family. Part of why it was, beep, 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 beep. Okay, let's see if I can run through these now. I want to just show you the visuals. We don't think of art therapy often as a modality, but it is for many of these individuals. I feel like I have 1,000 cuts. Here you see hate, fear, guilt, pain, remorse, a lot of moral emotions being discussed. TBI, PTSD, pain, very physical symptoms in addition. These are on some of them are on display at Walter Reed. They start with paper mache and then they spend group time working on these. Okay, this brings us to another mask, sort of, and that is Seneca. So I want to think about Stoicism, and can Stoicism leave room for moral injury? Does it have room for the emotions of moral injury, which may be guilt, remorse, shame, and forward-looking, which may be hope, trust, a sense of forgiveness, atonement, self-forgiveness, reconciliation, rapport, and those sorts of matters. So, and let's just sort of think about this. So this is officially Seneca the Younger, so 3 BCE to 65 Common Era CE, and the Seneca most of us know. I pick him because he's a pragmatic philosopher. He doesn't really know war in the way that Marcus Aurelius knows war, but he knows the muddy politics of water. So not the fog of war, but the mud of politics. He swims in those currents regularly. He is Nero's tutor, Nero's speechwriter, and Nero's sort of political advisor. And a few historical details should suffice. He came to the court through the interventions of Nero's mother, Agrippina. She was married to Claudius. I believe she killed Claudius in one of the many poisons, banishments, and suicides that happened in the empire. She brought him to her son because he was the best speechwriter in town. And she became his patron, takes him out of banishment in Corsica. Corsica then wasn't Corsica now. I don't think it's a destination. It's more like Siberia. It was then. And she wants Nero to get closer to the throne by having a good speechwriter and the powerful pen of Seneca. Seneca's motives then become keeping that emperor boy in power, even though that involves moving the mother out, who had fallen out of favor with her son. And there's no shortage of intrigue in this palace. If you want a good read on it, I, Claudius by Graves, Robert Graves, World War I writer. And there was the poisoning of Claudius' son Britannicus when he became of age to take the throne, a plot which Seneca probably knew about. And though Agrippina was Seneca's benefactor, to get him to the palace, he showed her limited gratitude in defending Nero's murder of her in a speech, which records suggest didn't go down so well with the public. So what comes around goes around, and Nero's anger may have been restrained on occasion, in part by Seneca's writing of On Anger. However, it never was managed, and Seneca must have been well aware of the threat, because in his later life, he writes the letters about quiet life, out of the public, and also about transience of power and mortality. And in 65, he orders his death. This is Rubens' famous painting, where it looks like there's a lot of straining. I wouldn't say there's a lot of calm in here. It's a forced suicide. He doesn't choose to have suicide. He has to wait till Nero says, do it. Tries many different ways, tries cutting and stuff, and finally it's hot water. I don't know how hot water can cause suicide, but there you go. And he dies in this way. So this is why do I offer you a little bit of history? It's a mini bio to remind us when Seneca writes about clemency, about anger, about constancy, and rails against materialism, as he does a lot, he writes as no moral or political naive. He knows the pull of wealth and power and the perils of trying to escape it under the eye of a watchful and vengeful tyrant. He takes up his pen in well-trained Stoic stance, in part to calm his own fears and to aspire to something pure. As he says often in his writings, I'm the doctor as well as the patient, and in need of Stoic medicine and healing. And so he rose from modest backgrounds, and he never really stayed out of Rome. He was not like Epictetus, or Musonius Rufus, who stayed out of the palace. This guy wanted to be in the palace. So in short, he's a pragmatist. He's in the political trenches, suffered its glory and infamy, and yearns for some personal moral change. He's an aspirant, a moral aspirant in some way, and that's the way I read him. So let's think a little bit about the room he might make for emotions. So in On Anger, sort of some philosophical background, he develops an account that is being used, I think, by a lot of people these days, a cognitivist account of emotions. It is the reigning theory in the psychology of emotions. And the idea is that some parts we like, the psychologists like the descriptive part, but not the prescriptive part. So ordinary emotional responses like anger, angry outbursts are on a Stoic view. This is a part that isn't easily adopted by moderns. Chosen actions for which we're held accountable. So there's volition for your emotions as well as your actions. And at the core of the idea is that you have this impression, Aristotle, this is from Aristotle essentially, of an injury, that you've been unjustly wronged. That's a passive event. You have that injury, and can I move with this? Yeah. You've got this injury, and you then have to grasp it. You have to sort of not just let it happen to you, but say yes, an assent. And then a judgment or belief is formed, hence the cognitive idea. But there are two beliefs that are formed. One belief is that that you've been unjustly wronged. The second belief is how I ought to act on that first belief. Both are evaluative. I oughtn't to have been wrong. I was unjustly wrong. And this is how I ought to respond. Okay, so these beliefs, which are emotions, are generally about goods and bads in the world. And the Stoic view is that they're just kinds of tensions in the mind. They are sort of mental physicalists of a sort. But these emotions are irrational in two key ways. The first is that typically emotions are, we'd say, recalcitrant. Once you start them, you can't stop them. So Kant bought that. The images are great. You're running, and someone says, hey, and you're already in stride. You can't stop. And another image that's given is you're on a precipice, and you're about to take a step. Once you take that fateful step, you can't go back up easily if it's a true precipice. So the idea is they don't heed reason easily. The second irrationality is far worse. And that second irrationality is that they're misevaluations. They're perversions of what's really good and evil. You're stuck on material stuff, external goods, when you should be directed, as Socrates taught us, only on virtue and avoidance of vice. So it's not that those external goods aren't good at all, they're just the wrong kinds of goods. They should be viewed as preferred and dispreferred indifference, not to get stuck on them or attached to them. So that doesn't mean you should get rid of all emotions, because we'd lose the amazing sensitivities that emotions allow for moral salience and other kinds of salience, danger, heat, all sorts of warnings that they give us. And so they allow for these things that we would call arousals, autonomic arousals, proto-emotions, they call them. Emotions that kind of, that catch you by surprise, almost like shudders and shakes, tremors and shivers. And some of the language is remarkably colorful and speaks to a military model here. This is Seneca on Anger, Book 2. Even the bravest man often turns pale as he puts on his armor. The knees of even the fiercest soldier tremble a little as the signal is given for battle. A great general's heart is in his mouth before the lines have charged against one another. Even in times of peace, a military man in civilian clothes pricks up his ears at the sound of a trumpet. If we were to see a parade on the parade grounds, we probably would feel the same. And so these are signals, but you don't assent to them. They give you some information. The sage can just say, let my body do it, but I'm not going to believe in the real threat that's out there, that it's a real bad. I'll just work on it. So you get enough information, but not more than enough. So the sage nips all that in the bud while still taking advantage of the adaptive radar, we might say, of these proto-emotions. No sticky attachments. But there's another way that the sage rises only as often as the phoenix, and that's almost never. So the idea, you have a defective exemplars is if you want to read Stoicism and take it seriously, be thinking always of defective, most of us are defective, and we need to not try to be a sage. So non-ideal theory, a plea for non-ideal theory. The sage will experience cultivated, healthier, good versions of basic emotions that have now a different kind of object, not external goods, but virtue and the avoidance of vice. And they're great in renaming things. They're neologists of sorts. So instead of desire, there's deliberative desire, deliberative wish. Instead of fear, there's rational wariness or caution. Instead of regular pleasure, there's joy, rational joy. Interestingly, there's no space for pain or distress, because the sage won't ever feel that. So that means, what if you're not a sage? Where's room for distress? And if Seneca's really just a patient and not just the doctor, where does he find room for this? Remember, he is talking about all the sorts of compromises to autonomy and rational autonomy that you could possibly face in a corrupt court. That is his milieu. And so he's appealed to readers over all these ages, from the Christians onward, because he talks about a condition of not being sin-free. He's in good company here, and aspiring to becoming better. So where is the theoretical room for what he seems to need himself? And remember, we want an emotion here because emotions aren't just radar, they're impulses. They move us forward. They have a lot of oomphiness to them. The Greeks call them, the Stoics break from Aristotle and calling them impulses. They're propulsive. And you need them. A sage who's emotion-free would be pretty phlegmatic. Not only not leap for joy, but also no tears. That would be horrible. Okay, so where are these emotions, both of joy but also of shame, that are the beginning of forgiveness, possibly mercy, atonement, reconciliation, and reinstatement in moral community? So I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of Alcibiades, but this is the season of Roman banquets, satyrs, the Last Supper. So picture, gather a few tables together, a lot of drink, always wine mixed with water, cushions, you're leaning like Romans, etc. Perhaps the Greeks did that as well. And we're giving economia to eros, to love. In comes Alcibiades, morally flawed and what would soon be known to history, the disastrous military leader who betrayed Athens to the Spartans. Socrates probably knows this, Plato probably knows this at the time of the writing, and he addresses his encomium to Socrates, not to Eros, but to a person. And he says, Socrates is the only person in the world who has ever made me feel ashamed. Because every time I'm in front of him, I realize what, a moral worm I am. I can't ever be as good as he is. And in his presence, I feel this tall. And moreover, I love him, as many of the tutees did toward their moral tutors in an age of not so okay pedestry, but it was rampant. Alcibiades is a tormented soul, a strange figure. He's not an ordinary acratic, recalcitrant, weak-willed person who knows clearly what he should do, but he doesn't do. He occasionally dips in the waters of virtue, but not often. And he doesn't yet have a superego, mostly in front of Socrates, so we're told. So he hasn't changed his habits much. He's not just recalcitrant, but he's probably ignorant of what the new values are and not yet committed to giving them a full try. And here you might think of some of Agnes Keller's recent work on aspiration. So this gives us a window into how non-scalar external goods and virtues can be. Aristotle struggled with this terribly. He didn't get very far. The Stoics brought him to task for that. And it's hard in a material world to give it up. Victory matters, decorations matter, next step up the career matters. And for Seneca, having sway with Seneca, Nero sort of mattered. It's a slow process of becoming. All this notwithstanding, the tears of Alcibiades becomes a challenge for Stoic thought. He cries about not yet being the good person and that he's so tormented in the presence of Socrates. And Cicero, not himself a Stoic, but a redactor, attracted to it, says, Cleanthes, he's the second forefather of Stoicism, he doesn't take the problem seriously enough. So this is Cicero. It seems to me that Cleanthes doesn't take sufficiently into account the possibility that a person might be distressed over the very things which Cleanthes himself counts as the worst of evils. For we're told that Socrates once persuaded Alcibiades he was unworthy to be called human. I should never do that to a student. And was no better than a manual labor despite his noble birth. Alcibiades then became very upset, a retelling of Socrates' story, of Plato's story, begging Socrates with tears to take away his shameful character and give him a virtuous one. What are we to say about this, Cleanthes? Surely you wouldn't claim that the circumstances which occasioned Alcibiades' distress weren't really a bad thing. So here you have Cicero saying, hey, get with the program. Isn't there a kind of moral distress that is at least a bridge to something better? And isn't that part of the human condition? So Cicero insists on the point in a later essay. Suppose a person's upset about his own lack of virtue, say his lack of courage, or say responsibility or integrity. The cause of his anxiety is indeed an evil, says Cicero. It's an impulse toward virtue itself. It propels forward. So now his therapeutic intervention is not to revise the correct judgment of the bad, but the faulty judgment. Don't go on crying. Don't have an inconsolable depression. Don't decompensate. Do something about it. It's not always within our capacity to not be depressed. So this is a bit of Stoicism, the grit part that isn't always realistic. So, but the critical point is that distress is a moment of moral aspiration. So does Seneca himself have any place for this? So I suggest he does we don't know the date of this, but in On Mercy. It's directed to Nero. Nero could use a little bit of it. And, and it didn't necessarily work. It might have been written after Nero kills his mother, who wanted to put his stepbrother in power. Not clear. But Seneca says, Nero, hold this up as a mirror to yourself to better see your ways. But it's also Seneca looking at himself. And it's probably the public. The public are Rome was, lessons for all of us. Rome was in a lot of distress. They didn't know who next was going to be banished, given a poison apple, or mushrooms were the favorite, poison mushrooms, or who would be forced suicides. So he's trying to calm the public, I think. But he writes a play. I think he's a playwright as well. And that I'm going to close on the note of the play. And it's not enough read, and I think it's wonderful. So Ed, wherever you are, maybe we could have a performance at lunchtime next year of the Trojan women. Yeah, I'm sure there's thespian talent hanging out in the wings there, waiting for the proscenium. Okay. So, in the essay, just to give a little backdrop, mercy is cast as the humane virtue in a world of human frailty. It's not pardon, it's not the remission of a deserved punishment, but leniency in exacting punishment, stopping short of what might have been deservedly imposed, what many mids hope a commandant will do in some transgression, like you forget your cover or you're carrying an umbrella when you shouldn't, those sorts of things. Okay. Quote, we all have sinned, some in serious, some in trivial things, some from deliberate intention, this is Seneca, some by chance impulse, or because we were led away by the wickedness of others. Some of us have not stood strongly enough by good resolution. Even if we become perfectly virtuous, we would have arrived there by some moral erring, this is me now, along the way. No sinless path toward moral progress. Okay, so it's the gentler side of grit and harsh discipline. So you see this in the play. So Trojan women, the war's over. This is a postbellum moment. The widows and the young girls and the children, something needs to be done with them. And Ulysses, Odysseus is on hand, but so is Agamemnon. And Agamemnon here turns out, the leader of the Greeks, turns out to be a calming influence. Ulysses, again, shows very little mercy. The women are pleading, and they're going to be made prostitutes. It's not the beginning of the Iliad, it's sort of the end. It's the same thing happens. They're going to be war brides, prostitutes, and the children are going to have to make up for the sins of their parents. It's an amazing play, I think deserves a good look. So, and it's brutal for the guy of calm, Seneca the Calm. If every muscle is twitching here, this play is twitching 25 times over. And the Romans loved brutality. The lunchtime recreation was in the amphitheater with gladiators and slaves thrown in to be eaten by lions. They couldn't get enough of it. And so this play probably wasn't performed except privately. The only one that really liked to perform was Nero. He was a big actor, and he had a kithera or lyre, and he loved the stage, and he made his own plays and deified himself a few times over. But this is sort of a food for the craving of brutality. So here it's not prisoners tossed to man-eating beasts, it's Trojan women and children at the mercy of their Greek captors. The Greeks, despite their victory, yet again find themselves without wind to set sail. Familiar scene. That's how the war began, and that's how it ends in this play. And following a familiar script, Calchas, the Greek priest, recommends that Hector and Andromache's young baby son, Astyanax, be sacrificed. And also Polyxena, the young daughter of Priam and Hecuba, she's going to be slaughtered as a war bride on Achilles' tomb by Achilles' proxy, Pyrrhus, his son. So rape of the women and pillage of property isn't enough. The children must bear the crimes of their fathers. And critically, Hector's boy stopped from becoming not just a boy warrior, but a man warrior who can reignite the epic of the Trojan War again. So Agamemnon urges Pyrrhus not to avenge his father's death with such shocking bloodshed. The plea for mercy makes its first appearance here. Quote, "First, learn the crucial lesson. There is an etiquette to victory, a limit to defeat. Those who abuse their power never stay in power long. Moderate governments survive." Seneca. When anger rages, he says, brutality, this is in the play, brutality and crimes against humanity abound. I'm reading Emily Wilson's translation of Professor of Classics at Penn. It's wonderful. Her work is wonderful. Agamemnon is on shaky moral grounds, of course, having sacrificed his own daughter Iphigenia in order to start this war. But here in Seneca's moral meditation, a gruesome slaughtering on a ghost's marriage bed, which even if it doesn't violate the laws of war, bends them just too far. It ought not be permissible. He'll try to set the post-bellum rules of engagement himself. I will not allow it. The faults of all my men return to me. Allowing a crime you can stop is instigation. Omission is commission. It's gratuitous, disproportionate, we'd say, indiscriminate bloodshed, with no military purpose. Pyrrhus can only lamely reply, he's the one that's going to commit this horrible act. Mercy often means giving death, not life. He loses the moral argument but wins the move, for he has the gods behind him, and too the Roman fascination in feasting on hideous savagery. So there's a torchlit wedding procession with a young maiden resolutely facing Pyrrhus's blows as blood gushes out from a massive gaping wound and soaks the ground of the tomb of the ghost groom in the tomb. But this isn't the only gruesome spectacle, and it brings us to a close. The baby, Astyanax, cast by the Greeks as future warrior boy, must too face his fate. His mother, Andromache, is in a mortal battle with Ulysses to protect her child. She's hidden Astyanax in Hector's tomb. Until now, she assures himself, tombs have been sacred cultural relics, though temples have been destroyed as part of the obliteration of the enemy. An important lesson for cultural heritage issues, which some of us are working on. The boy may be crushed and smothered by his father's corpse, but it's a chance she'll take to keep him from Ulysses' clutch. She begs Ulysses for mercy, for kindness, for herself as a mother whose child is her only comfort in war's ravages. The boy's no threat. He's too young. He's without any power. He can't rebuild a city. And she says, can this boy raise these ruins, this wreck of a city that's turned to dust? If this is all the hope of Troy, there is no hope. The absence of hope here is predictive. Troy's not going to rise again, and normative. This boy, it's not reasonable to aspire that this boy could lead the city onward. There's no future in Troy. The boy may be royal, but he's as good as a slave. Just put a yoke on his royal neck, says the mother. So to kill him is a crime of war, protests Andromache, and the atrocity will be pinned not on the gods, but on the mortals, on Ulysses. But again, a Greek warrior set on vengeance cannot stay the impulse. So that's the negative side of Seneca's lesson. I wish I could be merciful. I can't, answers Ulysses. He's a man of words, not of deeds, as we sort of know, the wily speechifier himself. The transmission of war transgenerationally will go on in violation of war's permissions. It's a wonderful lesson about transgenerational transmission of war. The spectacle again feeds the Roman hunger for gruesome violence. A throng, Trojan and Greek, gathers from afar and near to see the grandson of Priam, the great leader of the Trojans, meet his end. Some climb on trees, some stretch on their toes to get a peek of the impending violence. They're watching, Seneca tells us, in a space that itself mimics a theater. It's an enclosure with hills. Again, this young one shows stoic demeanor as his I guess it would be his aunt, does as a war bride. even though the theme of the play is about emotions excess. Perhaps Seneca is telling us that it's only the morally naive who, along with the perfect sage, can be free of all distress. After Ulysses chants the prophet's prayer, the boy steps off the steep embankment that was once the site of his grandfather Priam's famous watchtower. Astyanax's body immediately shatters with the impact of the plunge. His corpse is mangled. His skull cracks open. Brains spurt out. A little boy pulverized, as if by a high-impact bomb. Pleas of leniency, entreaties to restrain a victor's revenge, reminders that these children are victims, not contributors to war, the impotency of a ghost warrior groom, reminders that the aggression of the war is over. None of this stays the hands of the ruthless rage. Now, this is a strange play, we might think, for a moralist of calm. It's not the play that Silicon Valley, looking for calm, is going to read. Or maybe not, for maybe it's cautionary about excessive punishment and the difficulty of staying the impulse of revenge in war. But it's also about leniency in a more general way in the face of overzealous punishment, whether directed at an external enemy or the enemy within, which is often how moral injury takes its shape. So let us return where we began, with our naval aviator from this very institution, Layne McDowell. There were no formal investigations of the Kosovo incident by a very good reporter. It's not clear if there was a violation of fuller procedures that, were they to be followed, the accident would have been averted. What we know is that McDowell, above all else, is his own judge and revisits the scene in flashbacks and in interviews with Chivers. Chivers and I know each other, and I talked a bit about this. Presumably, he also revisits the scene as he checks for accuracy, which he did. Chivers typed up account of his quotes, and then as he reads later the full book. I don't know the impact of some of my writings on those I've written about, and I often worry about it. What he pictures is strikingly like that of Seneca's subject, Astyanax's demise, a young boy's body shattered, the back of his head missing, an innocent made all too vulnerable in war. What we hope for this Navy pilot is some mitigation of self-punishment, some leniency, some self-forgiveness, some atonement that allows for a way to move beyond the rage of distress without losing the moral meaning or insights that may come from the anguish. Seneca, to conclude, is a strange moralist of calm. For what sometimes parades as conscience is the rumbling of a messy, un-Freudian unconscious and its conflicts. He yearns for simplicity and tranquility as one who's attracted to the world of high-stake power and violence. Modern-day warriors also live in a complicated, high-stake moral world, yearning for autonomy and self-discipline, but willing to be in institutions that can vastly limit that control, exposed to situations that constantly test their best judgment and capacity for constraint, and as John Doris has told us, often make us more subject to context than to our own characters. Exposure to moral injury is no surprise in that environment. But the Senecan lesson I've been urging is that that very injury may in some cases be a part of moral growth and the beginning of calm, of moral repair. To read Stoicism as forswearing the possibility of good moral distress is just to miss Seneca's more profound teachings about moral growth and resilience. Thank you. If I can still have it, can I still have power here? There we go. So some people asked about books, those are some of them. And I have to just make a comment about this. These are non-midshipmen. Anyone know what uniform that is?
VMI.
Yeah, it's VMI, exactly. And do you know what they're reading?
Ginsberg's Howl.
Yeah, why are they reading it?
It's an English class.
It's an English class. Okay, and what else? So the guy who's teaching that English class is the teacher. and was Ginsburg's gardener. And they are waiting for Ginsburg to come in. They are anxious, and he's late. And they're wondering, what's this guy going to teach us? And he said he was more anxious than they are. Thank you. Marcus, thank you. Not a plant. Yes, hi, Nick.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you again for a really insightful and really provocative talk, as always. I wanted to ask you, and this is something Ed Baird and I have discussed, and I think he has discussed out, so I have to channel him to some extent. But we've talked about the doctrine of double effect and the way in which it purports to rely on the notion of intention to suggest that there really isn't a wrong that's being perpetrated. And whether that creates a significant discrepancy between perhaps conceptions of legal and even moral responsibility and the actual phenomenology of what people experience. I'm wondering whether, in fact, thinking of it less in those terms, but thinking of it more in lesser evil terms, would vindicate that feeling that many have of guilt, and yet also maybe be a bridge and a way to enable them to move forward. That is a recognition and acknowledgement, rather than using double effect to say, well, you really shouldn't feel responsible because you didn't do anything wrong. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm going to almost pass to Tony on this, and he and I have had conversations a lot about this, Tony Pfaff. Just because I don't know, first of all, I really don't know, though I purport to know, how reasoning and rational thought gets laid down emotionally. I really don't know, and I'm not sure what neuronal stuff would tell me. Even body, how when you do this and I do this, mirror neurons, all that stuff. I've spent a lot of time thinking about mirror neurons. I'm not sure what I've learned after all that, even if I can maybe have certain pathways that you have because I also have a repertoire for them. So I don't know how things, what makes you feel better or not. I'm hoping maybe Shira can help me out with that. And whether not thinking about it as foreseen yet unintended, what weight does that have? There's 25 million epicycles at your university, at the law school, and other places on foreseen but unintended, and whether it does anything or not. And also, I think Tony's work's been so important on minimize collateral damage to the point where you still have a mission and you're not losing too many of your own troops. That kind of transfer of risk. Is that a way of stating some of your views?
Pretty close,
Yeah. I think that's very important. And it's not like unavoided. It's not totally avoided. That's why the Zarqawi case I gave, that was sort of an easy one. There's going to be collateral there. The target is worth it, maybe. And so there's a lesser evil kind of thing. Yeah. This case of Astiani, this is gratuitous, but I think the Romans, the end, that's just gratuitous violence. I think the Romans are feeding on it, and it's a culture and one to avoid. I'll be brief, so I can get your...
The question has to do with moral distress, the term that's used is moral distress. And in the concept of stress, implies a tension between two opposing forces. And so thinking about where is the stress in moral distress. Now, thinking about injury, using the medical concept of injury and a wound, you have an injured tissue or an injured organ system. And one of the core dilemmas about looking at moral injury is what is the structure that is injured?
Yeah, all these terms are metaphors, okay? If I were talking to some of my colleagues, it's about damage, moral damage. Other colleagues, it's moral burden. And moral injury, I often use it to refer to experiences that are taken to be injurious. So I'm already
I'm already having an agent experience at something. Something that's a trigger or stimulus for someone is not a trigger or stimulus for someone else. It's a potentially injurious circumstance, but it isn't necessarily. So I'm often thinking of it, I get fast into the emotions. I'm often thinking of it, the injurious emotion, the injurious experience as shown or as experienced, excuse the double use of experience, as experienced in specific kinds of emotions that can be spectral, from mild guilt to shadow, the term that your folks, Shira and Brett and Bill used is shattered moral identity. I don't quite know what that means, but, meaning they lost their moral they are gone. Decompensated is often the psychiatric term. You can't function anymore psychologically. And that certainly happens. So there is no, psyche doesn't have tissue, but it sure is real.
Just a clarification on that. The reason why it's also important.
It does have tissue. I mean, there are lots of neuronal correlates, yeah.
The reason why it's also important is that there are people, if there is a moral structure, okay, at the base of this, the reason why it's important is that there are some people who should have moral injury but don't.
Well, there are wantons out there, and this goes to Susan's work yesterday with you, Tony, that there are people for whom there ought to be dissonance, but they choose a dominant story. I guess it was also what John Doris, just to sort of tie some loose ends, was talking about in terms of David Velleman's work. There are some people who don't, have dissonant stories, but pick a dominant rationalization, and that's what they go with. Yeah. To be continued. Other questions? Yes. I'm sorry, and I ignored this side of the room. And then you, yeah. Here's a
Nancy, great presentation. I just want to highlight one of the things that I think really hits home. When Admiral Stockdale was in the Hanoi Hilton, they would always be tortured in order to give information. And one of the things that would happen was they would be tortured, and eventually everybody broke after a certain point. Everyone broke. And you'd go back to your cell, and you'd feel really, really lower than whale poop. I mean, you've given up your buddies. And one of the things that they did was they said, if you could only see what I had done. And I think that was one of the things that helped them cure that moral dissonance, that the other POWs would tell them, I did a lot worse, and don't worry about it. And I think that's one of the key things that Stockdale used to get through his experience.
He always would say, there are no saints here. Yeah, no virgins was his phrase, but yeah.
Yeah, ma'am, I'm Kim Donahue, and I work at Walter Reed Bethesda, and so also have worked at NICO.
Thank you. So you know these masks?
Yes.
And Melissa, yes.
Yes, I do, very well. And I'm a chaplain, and I want to kind of shout out to all the chaplains that are here. There's quite a large number of us, because we are often those privileged individuals who hear of the moral struggles of our service members and colleagues. I happened to have known the gentleman who did the horse drawing. Yeah, and I know he did a second one as well after the work that he did at NICO. And that second drawing was of the same horse with one of his hoofs lifted out. It was in a reflection of the impact of the work that all of those at that center did with him, to include the chaplain. When you were talking about the play, I noticed there were two things. The two characters that struck out and asked for, come on, we have to think about this. Let's not do this. Priest and a female, a woman.
The priest says, do it.
Ah, okay. So their voice.
Greek and Roman priests are not so good.
Yeah, but there's strong voices that are lifted up as,
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there has been any work or study that you know of, or if you've done, on the impact of prior involvement in a religious tradition on moral injury.
So the person, I haven't seen that horse drawing, and this is one that he was.
Incredible. I have a copy of it.
Okay, Vic Bruner, who had worked there at the time, shared this with me. He himself had said that he had religion and gave it up after. I mean, it was a hard struggle. I don't have any specific scholarly work on that. or could really refer you to that. I certainly know the incredible importance of chaplains in the mental health intervention in these wars, and we need more of them, and more. I was told by someone at Georgetown who's doing a PhD in his Army chaplain and lieutenant colonel, and a West Point graduate, and he said that something like one behavioral health specialist for 4,000 in the Army. That sounds horribly understaffed, but I don't know. And I don't know about chaplains. I don't know. But thank you for that.
Okay, yesterday, at several points we heard quotes from Goethe. And one of my favorite sentiments ever expressed by Goethe was something to the effect that there's no excuse to have anything less than a 3,000-year-old mind. Right? With access to 3,000 years of wisdom from kind of classical philosophers and such, to today, we can kind of make ourselves better by the cumulative product of 3,000 years. And while, as Professor Sherman points out, that a sage may be as rare as a phoenix, we benefited from kind of sage wisdom drawing from the time of the ancients, spanning the arts, and I mean, what a breadth of conversation here this morning. In fact, you've heard it here first. I will form a Stockdale Center competitive dance team.
I need a twist partner. I think it's my husband.
Absolutely, yeah.
My
And
husband
Barrett?
said if it doesn't work, just remember da-da-da-da-da-da.
I got the music, I'll do the music.
All right, Admiral Baker, General Whistler, Ed Barrett, team captain.
Those mids are coming back.
That's right. Nobody actually wants to see that. But what a breadth of conversation this morning, a perfect way to kick off day two. And as that Plank Owner Plus that I mentioned before, the moral compass that we've been handing out, that we do hand out as part of everything we do practically, seems a little insufficient for the visionary who got this thing kicked off. But a small token on behalf of all of us, really, and on the wisdom that you shared with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And let's take 15.